Thank you. So that's a hard act to follow, Finn. So my job today is to tell you about some of the research that we've done in America with Wine Australia. And our job is to talk to wine consumers and the wine trade to find out what they're thinking, specifically about Australian wine and the competitive market. So first I'm going to start actually with I've been asked to give you a little bit of information about the U.S. market, which is going to be different from Finn's. And this is some data that I've gathered from a lot of different sources in the U.S. Some may be familiar to you. So as you know, we consume a lot of wine in the U.S. Last year, or year ending 2016, 378 million cases entered the U.S. market. If you look at these bars, you've got lots of different colors. That blue part at the top, that is imports, packaged imports. The gray is bulk. And that makes up about a quarter of the wine that enters our market. So we've seen a 2.8% growth rate compared to last year, or actually 2015. And as you can see, it's been growing. Our market's been growing continuously. Looking at wine sales, imports make up about 25% of all U.S. wine sales by volume and about 29% in value. This data is from Nielsen. They gather all of their data at point of sale, so it includes scan data from it represents most of the market, but they only capture scannable products at grocery stores, convenience stores, any place that scans. So we're missing a little bit of a chunk of shops that don't use have a scan system or a lot of on-premise, but this gives you a pretty good picture of our sales and the percentage of imports. This is also based on Nielsen data, and this is kind of complicated, but it's a representation of percent change, volume on the vertical axis and value on the horizontal axis. And as you can see here, Australia saw negative growth in both value and volume. Again, this all is ending in 2016. But the bubbles show the share of market. So Australia has a nice chunk of the market and is doing better than Germany and Chile and Argentina. Again, this is the end of 2016. If you look at just varietals, and these are I just picked out red varietals to give a comparison. This is again based on scan data. It is the upper end of the market where we're seeing increases. These different colored boxes show various changes in growth. Cabernet, red blends, and Pinot are really taking the lead, and a lot of the growth is in the upper over $10, over $11 segments. As you can see, Shiraz, this is again at the end of 2016, was showing negative growth. But this is not just Australian Shiraz. This is Syrah Shiraz in the U.S. market from all origins. So U.S. Syrah is not doing very well either. The not good news is the data from Wine Australia shows that starting in 2017 or end of October, so the 12 months before October, there has been some increases in Australian Shiraz in the, say, 15 to 20 and the 25 plus category. So that is really good news. So this is where I'm going to talk about the U.S. consumer, which is more of my expertise. And I'm going to show you some information about the world of the wine consumer. The data I'm going to show you here is from the Wine Market Council, but I'm going to start by telling you something else. I'm going to tell you about the population of the U.S. So how is the U.S. population changing? Our population has been growing. It grew 4.5% between 2010 and 2016. It's getting younger. Our younger generations are growing, and our older generations are shrinking. And it's getting extremely diverse. So between 2010 and 2016, 96% of that 4.8% increase in population was represented by minorities. So currently 39% of the US is minority, and especially the younger group. I mean, the youngest generation, 50% minority. So we're really changing. We've got a very diverse community, and it continues to change. So this Wine Market Council data, Wine Market Council is a nonprofit, and their job is to provide data to their members, and their members range from growers to retailers to wholesalers. We give unbranded research to the members. And the mandate is really to kind of, originally was and still is today, to learn more about the wine consumer in general and to actually segment them. So this slide shows you the total US adults broken down by their wine consumption. 40% of US adults drink wine. And we think of them in two tiers. High-frequency wine drinkers drink wine more often than once a week, and occasional wine drinkers drink wine once a week or less often. The rest of that circle shows you the non-wine drinkers. So 27% of the US drinks alcohol, but not wine. 9% are just infrequent alcohol consumers. They might have a glass of wine at a wedding, every 6 months. And then a quarter of the population does not drink wine or beer or spirits at all. We talk a lot about generations in the US, and there's two ways that you can break down the wine drinker population, and I think both of them are really helpful in understanding the US. So, in the last 10 years, we talk about generations. Everyone hears about millennials. So the millennials and the baby boomers are our two largest generations, and they make up about 2/3 of the wine drinkers. But millennials, who we used to think of as in their 20s, the oldest millennial turned 40 this year. So there's a big difference between someone that's 24 years old and their wine habits and someone that's almost 40 with a family or not, or there's just a big difference. Same with baby boomers. Baby boomers range from 53 to 71. And so we're starting to shift into looking at wine drinkers in age bands, because then you can really pinpoint what people are doing in their 20s, what people are doing in their 30s. And I think that's a really important point for trying to understand our wine industry, because when you think about millennials, just itself is a very diverse group of people. So again, high-frequency wine drinkers are about 1/3 of the wine drinker pool. Occasional wine drinkers are 2/3. Those high-frequency wine drinkers are a very important group of people because they're the most interested in wine. They have a lot of wine knowledge. They're very engaged in wine, most of them, and most importantly, they drink most of the wine in the US. So wine, when I get to wine opinions, I'll explain why we think that's important. From an importer state point of view, typically wine drinkers, we ask them questions about how much wine they drink that's red or white or imported or domestic. About 30% of the wine that consumers drink is imported. High-frequency wine drinkers, that is a little higher. They drink a little bit more imported wine. When you break down those high-frequency wine drinkers by age bands, you can see that the people coming in, the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds drink the most imported wine. So that's really great news. So Wine Opinions is it's about a 15-year-old company, and as researchers in the industry, we started to realize that these high-frequency wine drinkers are a really important group. They're really hard to get at. So Wine Opinions has a consumer panel of 17,000 wine drinkers, and they sign up for this panel, and the population's about in the high 80s%, or about 85, 87% are high-frequency wine drinkers. We also have a trade panel. So we have a panel of 500-600 members of the trade of all tiers that will answer questions and join discussions about wine. So that's what all of this wine research I'm going to talk about is based on. So we've been part of a 5-year research campaign that Wine Australia is headed on this journey of doing research, and we just finished year 3. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is year 3 research. In the first couple years, we've done a mix of qualitative and quantitative research. We've talked to consumers, we've talked to the trade, We've also done some data mining with wine.com, which is a very large online retailer, only sells wine online in the States. So we learned in year 1 and 2, we had a couple takeaways, so I want to mention that before I move into what we did this year. From the consumer perspective, we found in our first couple years of research, there was some negative perceptions about Australian wine, highest among those who spend the most on wine. They had lower quality perceptions of Australian wine. They disliked the perceived, I want to say, flavor of what they think Australian wine is. They have this idea that Australian wine is just mass-produced, or they had one bad experience and they just never tried anything else. From the trade perspective, we started to see a shift away from thinking of Australia as a value wine producer. More importantly, when a lot of the trade would talk about some of the higher end wines and the more expensive wines that they tried from Australia, they loved them. And their only complaint was that, where do I get more? Really hard to find them and find a source for them. So in year 3, taking into consideration what we learned in year 1 and year 2, we decided let's just focus on 3 research goals or questions. The first is this whole idea of looking at Australia and Australian wine and what Americans think about Australia as Australia and wine, Australian wine, and see if there's any correlation. Does what Americans think of Australia have anything to do with their choices in choosing or perceiving Australian wine? 2, we wanted to delve deeper into Shiraz trends from the consumer and the trade perspective, as well as sales data perspective, which is where the wine.com part comes in. And 3, we wanted to identify challenges for building this higher price segment of the Australian wine business and explore some of the barriers. So let's start with the first one, the relationship between perceptions of Australia and interests in its wines. I'm going to pull from all the different research we did, so I'm going to be flipping back and forth to consumers and trade. First, I'm going to start with consumers. So, we did a very large quantitative study of about 1,500 wine drinkers, and we split them into groups, and we asked them what they thought top of mind, what comes to mind when you think of Australia, and we let them write in it wasn't a multiple choice. They wrote in their answers, and then we went through all of them and correlated them. So what did they think about Australia? Kangaroos and the outdoors. There were some cultural mentions of phrases, g'day, mate, those types of things. And what did they think about the wine? Shiraz was the #1 answer. And a lot of stylistic comments about being big and bold and fruity and jammy and inexpensive. And again, this is from the consumer's point of view. We also asked them about California wine, and we asked them about French wine, and we asked them about Italy and the countries, what they thought about those countries. So California, very similar to, we don't have kangaroos, but very similar in that they think of California as the beach, and different geographical, aspects of California, laid back, that kind of thing. Wine-wise, what comes top of mind is Napa, but also a lot of the same types of descriptions of what the wine is, that they talked about big and bold and red and jammy, interestingly enough. France, people think of Paris, and they think of art, and they think of culture, and they think of the Eiffel Tower. And the thing that comes up first for wine in that country is Bordeaux and expensive. Italy, also, a lot of people think of history and culture and art. And wine-wise, what came up first was food friendliness and red wine, Chianti in particular, but still big and bold and full-bodied. Another way to get at that whole cultural relationship is we gave a list of attributes and asked consumers to choose the ones that they thought best describe those countries. So Australia, the majority of respondents felt Australia is friendly, cheerful, and laid back. Interestingly enough, what does Australia have in common with California? Being friendly and laid back. And what do they have in common with Italy? Being friendly and cheerful. So we know that California and Italy sells a lot of wine in the value level and in the high-end level. So it doesn't seem, from our perspective, that that's really holding back Australian wine. Also, if you look down at the bottom, serious and sophisticated, France comes out on top on serious and sophisticated, but California comes out quite low also. And again, California sells a lot of high-end wine. The only clue we have here that I think that we can explore a little further and is great food and luxury products. There was the biggest discrepancy between those numbers, the great food numbers and the luxury numbers, with especially France and the other countries. California's not a country, other regions. And that may be some area that we can kind of correlate where there could be some opportunity to try to promote and maybe increase chances of selling some of these higher-end wines. So the trade, the trade this year we did an online discussion. It's kind of like a focus group, but it's a product we have called Vintrospectives, and we moderate an online discussion for 3 days. What's really hard about the trade is you cannot get them to show up at a focus group, and if you have them show up at a focus group, you only get trade from one area. So what's really nice is I recruit people from all over the country. So for Wine Australia, we wanted to have retailers and a couple distributors, and I made sure we had, a retailer from all the different markets that were very important to Wine Australia. I picked distributors that distribute in some of the big markets, and so you can get a perspective of a larger group of diverse tradespeople. So in that discussion, we talked about what people think of Australia, and geography and nature came up, places, iconic places, people, gregarious people, friendly people, people with cool accents, people who work hard and play hard, movies, and food and beverage. And wine is not included in that food and beverage, so I wanted to keep that separate. We didn't want that to, we wanted to talk about wine separately. So when we talked about wine, Shiraz came up first, Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre blends, some other varietals. Appellations, the Barossa comes up first. Producers, just a couple of producers came up. So when I talked to them about what kind of similarities they felt the people and the wine of Australia had, I got a few themes came up. Big and bold. So that was one very loose association between a stereotype of Australia and just one single type of Australian wine. Friendly. Friendly, they translated into fruit forward and easy drinking. Only one person talked about Australia not being serious. That really did not come up very often. I think that's a very, it's a narrow conclusion. Not many people think of Australia as not friendly. They are not serious. They think of people as friendly. Think of it more positively. So the bottom line, again, is that these are very loose connections that doesn't really come up in any of the other data. Let's talk about consumer perceptions of Australian wine in general. We talked to people who drink Australian wine and people that don't drink Australian wine. The majority of the people that drink Australian wine agreed that Australia does produce a lot of high-quality wine. Good quality, widely available. They also agreed that awareness of some of the smaller artisanal Australian wines, very low awareness. Over half of them agreed that Australian wine's food friendly, and you get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of flavor. A lot of flavor for a good price. So asking people who don't drink much Australian wine why, the biggest reason is that they just prefer something else, simple as that. 30%, a third of them thought, just don't know. They don't have a lot of experience with Australian wine, they haven't tried it. Only 20% don't like it, tried it and didn't like it, had a bad experience, or don't see Australian wines that they're interested in. So drilling down into Shiraz, we asked people what Australian varietals have you purchased in the last 2 years, and Shiraz rose to the top, 3/4 of them. Cabernet and GSM were second, but a big jump to the second tier wines. So Shiraz is number one, but Shiraz also was rated highest in quality. So we asked the people that had purchased that type of wine, what do you think of it? And they rated them on a scale from poor to delicious. And Shiraz came out top. GSM came up as a top quality wine. Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. Semillon is on a smaller base, but still very, very positive. We also asked them, how has your Shiraz purchases changed? So, compared to 2 years ago, are you buying more, less, or the same amount or bottles of Shiraz? Most people are buying about the same. There was an overall decrease because 23% said, yes, we are buying more, and 15% are buying less. And interestingly enough, the age band that are buying less, had the biggest rates of purchasing less Shiraz were in their 50s. So people who had lived through the critter season of Australian wine. So trying to get at what else Shiraz drinkers are drinking. So we took those people who said they're drinking more, we took those people who are drinking less, and we did some cross-tabbing because we'd also asked them what else they're drinking more and less of. So this is kind of a confusing chart. But if you look at the people drinking more Shiraz, they decreased over the same time period their California Syrah, their California Cabernet, and Malbec purchases. People who are drinking less Shiraz are buying more Italian, Spanish reds, and red blends, U.S. red blends. Interestingly enough, though, people who are buying more Shiraz are also buying more Spanish reds and red blends. So that is a source of competition. Spain is big in the U.S. right now. Spanish food, Spanish wine, Spanish everything. And red blends are also very big in the U.S. And that is a source of competition. So wine.com, like I said, is an online retailer, big online retailer. And we have a partnership with them, and we wanted to delve into some sales data of some Shiraz consumers. So the wine.com universe of shoppers is different from your typical wine drinker. They spend, on average, $30 a bottle on the wine they buy through the platform. Wine.com Shiraz buyers spend slightly less, but still, those people spend $26 a bottle on average. Again, this is all in US dollars. We looked at changes in purchases by varietal and wine type rather than country of origin. So this is going to give us a little bit different slant on what we learned from other sources. And we looked at 2 periods of time, purchases between mid-year 2015 and mid-year 2016, and then another period, mid-year 2016 to 2017. We didn't find any differences in demographics, any demographic differences between Shiraz buyers and the typical wine.com buyers. Wine.com doesn't track a lot of demographics, which you would expect that they wouldn't, but they do track like gender and age. So I know this is a very busy chart, but what we did was we looked at the red wine purchases of Shiraz buyers. So in period 1, you qualified by buying Shiraz, and that first column shows you their share of red wine. So they bought 13% of the red wine they bought in that period was Shiraz. And then we found, from that population, we took those people that didn't buy it in period 2, or decreased their purchases. So in period 2, those same people bought 11%. And so the question was, well, what else did they buy? What went up and what went down? So key takeaways. The decrease in Australian Shiraz purchases was part of a decrease in Australian wine in general across the board, GSM, red blends, and other Australian red wines. They also bought less non-Australian Syrah and GSM Rhone wines. They bought less Zinfandel, they bought less Bordeaux, they bought less Sangiovese. What they bought more of was non-Australian red blends, those U.S. blends, non-Australian Cabernet was the big winner, Pinot Noir, Malbec, and Merlot. And you can see that 4.6 that I've highlighted. So most of that change that was the California, mostly California Cab was the beneficiary. Red blends don't seem to be a big source of competition. And again, this is different from what we learned from the other data that I showed, the consumers and other trade information I got. The trade in our discussion groups really did not see this trend. We really think that this is due to the fact that these are people buy wine online and they buy expensive wines online and they buy a lot of Cabernet. They buy a lot of Cabernet. So in our discussion groups, when I talk to the trade, very diverse experiences with Shiraz. So for example, Adam, who's a retailer, a big retailer in LA, he has most success with $15 to $25 Shiraz because his customers really like the fact that the Shiraz that he brings into his store is so diverse and it's so different, and they find that very interesting. This retailer from New Jersey, he has a hard time getting people to understand that Shiraz is a great wine and has to compete with Cabernet and Pinot Noir sales. This person is a retailer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is in the middle of our country, and he's a retailer but also has a wine bar in his shop, and he sells much more $20 Shiraz than $12 Shiraz. And then there's the retailer in New York City who says Shiraz under $15 sells itself. He says, you know, that works for his store. So there's no single story. You know, the U.S. is very diverse, not only its people, but the retail shops and the pockets where they're located. There was an interesting discussion about GSM versus Shiraz. We had one distributor in California who said for her market, GSM is doing great. You know, people want red blends, and the GSM fits right into that pocket of interest in her area in California. Then again in New York, some people have a hard time selling the GSM, and Shiraz does a lot better. So during this conversation, we asked, well, what do you find people buying instead of Shiraz and instead of GSM? So for Shiraz, they found that Zinfandel, Malbec, and red wines from Chile were kind of the competition in that area, and for GSM, obviously the Rhone was a competitor. So challenges of building a higher priced segments. So I'm going to run through some of the challenges that we identified. Perceptions of quality. We asked about perceptions of quality of these major countries, France and Italy and California, and respondents rated the wines from France and Italy and California higher than Australian, especially the frequent $20 plus buyers. So that is a hurdle. How much would someone pay for a special occasion wine? So we asked people to look at these price segments and said, so if you were going to buy a special occasion wine from France, what's the most you would spend? What's the most you would spend on a wine from California? What's the most you would spend on a wine from Australia? California and France and Italy came out on top. People were willing to spend more for those wines for a special occasion. Spain was kind of in the middle, and Australia, Argentina, and Chile really hovered around that $30 price point as the highest that they would spend. We also asked if you were going to buy a wine for a friend that likes big and bold red wines and you were going to spend about $30, which wine would you choose? Cabernet, Bordeaux, Shiraz, and Rhone. California Cabernet, Napa Cabernet really overshadowed everything, even Bordeaux, actually, by twofold. Shiraz and Rhone were tied. So we asked them why. Why did you choose Napa Cabernet? Why did you choose Bordeaux? So in all cases, people chose the wine. The top reason was because it's my favorite. This is what I like to drink. And I want to share that with whoever they're giving the gift to. Also, they all chose the wines because they're big and bold and red, so that's their perception of what's big and bold. The differentiation came in some of the comments that weren't the top comments, but people buy Cabernet and Bordeaux because it's reputation. You know, I know that it's impressive. It's going to impress somebody. And people would choose the Shiraz and Rhone because it's unique. So there is this challenge of competition on both ends of the spectrum. From the value wines, it's about Spain and it's about South America. On the higher end, it's competition with those old world wines, the Bordeaux's, not old world, but the Cabs, those wines that have a big reputation. That's a real tough perception to challenge. And this guy Steve from New Jersey said it's really up to the wine industry in Australia to find their voice and change the conversation to their favor. New world versus old world. I think the big takeaway here is that there's perceptions that this is actually a wine.com person who talks to a lot of consumers, that consumers think when they think quality, they think of Europe, and when they think of value, they think of the Southern Hemisphere. She felt that that was a perception that needed to be overcome. The perception that the New World as a whole is not as serious as the Old World, and France was pointed out as a country that really has this solid reputation for high-end wines, and so whenever a value wine enters the market, it doesn't tarnish their reputation at all. France's reputation was built from the top down. I think also what was really clear in all of these discussions was that a lot of the issues that people think are Australian issues are really not Australian issues. They're issues for all New World wines. So finally, I have a couple last thoughts. I have two quotes. This first one really caught my eye. What's a little hard is the food pairing. French wine with French food, Italian wine with Italian food, Napa wines with steak, Australian wines with a bloomin' onion. People don't know what a gem Australia is when it comes to food and wine and culture. We just don't have any clue. That is a great opportunity to get the word out that there's so much to offer. It's a cuisine that's has so many different aspects to it, and that pairs so well with all of these different wines. And also, this quote is a great representation because it really shows how perceptions are shifting, especially among the trade. Fortunately, the critter label fad seems to be declining, and people are leaning more towards higher quality, higher priced Australian wines. And this was agreed upon by everyone in the group, that they really have, anytime they taste these wines, they're always impressed. There's no question about the quality of the wines. So this is changing. The trade perception is changing, consumer perception is starting to change. I'm really looking forward to our last 2 years of research and to learn from the consumer and the trade perspective how successful Australia can be. Thank you.